Hi everyone, my name is Florencia and this is Mariela Masuyama, and today's session is going to be about developing remote teaching through observations. We will introduce you to the work of the British Council Argentina Remote Teaching Center within the Ceibal en Inglés program. We will also talk about the dynamics brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, the approaches to professional development in the remote teaching center, and within that, we will share with you the CPD framework and learning development approach we use, the observation scheme we have, and the instruments we use for that. Then we will share with you an analysis of quantitative and qualitative findings and feedback from teachers who participated in this CPD scheme. And finally, we will share our conclusions. So, Plan Ceibal en Inglés is Plan Ceibal's program for teaching English in public and primary schools through different video conference equipments installed in different schools in Uruguay. Kids receive their English lessons once a week with teachers that are in different parts of the world and use the same video conference equipment in different remote teaching centers where they deliver the lessons from. And these lessons, the remote teacher delivers, are monitored by the classroom teacher that is with the kids in the classroom and who delivers the lessons every day of their in their native language of the different subjects. So in this work, in this program, the classroom teacher improves their English level through the variety of guided online courses and workshops, and students have their level of English from the beginner level to A1, A2 level on the CFR by the end of 6th grade. So in this sense, the work of British Council in the program started in 2012 from the Remote Teaching Center in downtown Buenos Aires, and involves more than 100 teachers, more than 100 remote teachers, and we reached more than 568 Uruguayan state primary schools. This also means reaching more than 30,000 students in the whole country, which was done progressively through the years. We started with 250 lessons per week to 1,300 lessons delivered per week. So over to you, Mariela.
Now, let us briefly comment on the changing dynamics brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, while the work of the British Council Teaching Centre within Ceibal en Inglés already involved remote lessons, the closure of our facilities in Buenos Aires, as well as schools in Uruguay under the various stages of lockdown during the pandemic, meant that the delivery of the programme had to be adapted quite drastically. As you can see in the timeline in the next slide, during 2019 and earlier, our lesson cycle was made up of a lesson A, with the remote teacher delivering 45-minute lessons to learners at school in real time through video conferencing equipment, and lessons B and C facilitated by the classroom teacher in person with the students at school, with both teachers coordinating weekly objectives and activities. Now, from 2020, with the onset of the pandemic, the situation called for a new modality as teachers and learners had to remain at home. So a distance learning model was implemented. Remote teachers recorded weekly videos, and learners worked autonomously in a virtual learning environment on weekly missions. Synchronous encounters between the remote teacher and the learners were limited to 15-minute weekly telepresence sessions hosted on platforms such as Big Blue Button or Zoom. And although the pandemic continued in 2021, some changes were introduced in the first term, namely the introduction of a new platform, Little Bridge, for learners to work autonomously from home, and a switch to missions that lasted 3 weeks instead of 1. Now, in the second term, with the gradual reopening of schools in Uruguay, there was a move towards a more blended model with a return to longer live lessons, and learners started receiving lessons that ranged from 25 to 45 minutes in length with the remote teacher in real time each week. So each of these changes and new modalities was impactful and meant that our remote teachers had to quickly adapt, acquire new knowledge, and develop a range of new skills that suited each mode of delivery of our program. And this in turn meant that our remote teaching center had to support the remote teachers by offering relevant and timely professional development activities. And this is what we're going to share with you today. Now, let's have a look at our approach to continuing professional development at the Remote Teaching Center. There were two main pillars for our proposal. One of the pillars of our CPD proposal was the British Council's 70-20-10 learning and development approach, which acknowledges that within our busy schedules, it can be difficult to carve out formal time for learning and development, and suggests that the bulk of this learning should actually be done having to do with learning that we naturally engage in through our day-to-day work. And this represents 70% of our learning and development programs, while 20% should take place through learning from others and self-learning through experiences such as feedback, mentoring, coaching, accessing resources, and only 10% through face-to-face interventions. And this is why, to ensure significant and meaningful learning, our development proposal wanted to focus on more than just simply offering training and courses to remote teachers. So the CPD observation scheme that we're going to share with you today is part of this 70% on-the-job learning, and seeks to give shape and structure to reflective practices that teachers were naturally engaging in through their day-to-day work in the classroom. The second pillar of our CPD proposal was the British Council's CPD framework, which lists the different stages of development for teachers, which are shown in the graph on the right, and that have to do with awareness, understanding, engagement, and integration. And we wanted our observation scheme to support remote teachers in progressing through these different stages. The in-house observations and self-observations that we're going to share with you today center on key elements in our program's instructional framework, which is detailed in the observation instruments that we're going to show you shortly, and help remote teachers to reach these awareness and understanding stages by having them examine practices that ought to be effectively carried out in a high-quality lesson. Peer observations similarly aided remote teachers in achieving the understanding stage by exposing them to real-life examples of theory in practice by colleagues, and feedback conversations that took place after in-house observations, as well as reflective tasks in self-observation, and subsequent action plans designed between remote teachers and their coordinators aim at remote teachers' development towards the engagement and ultimately integration stages. Now I'm going to hand over back to Florencia to tell us more about this observation scheme.
This was our observation scheme, which was product of taking the COVID situation into account. As Mariela mentioned, our lessons, our remote lessons were affected by this, as students were no longer at school but at home, which meant that teachers were forced to rethink their knowledge and beliefs about good practices in this remote learning and teaching context. So webinars, courses, and literature were insufficient in this new scenario. So in order to meet the Ceibal and English requirements and the British Council quality standards, this observation scheme was created. So as you can see, there are three different types of observations. The in-house observation looks for providing teachers with feedback on techniques and methods with an eye of helping them evaluate their strengths and weaknesses and different strategies to improve their practice. This feedback that teachers are given must be objective, systematic, supportive, and motivating. And these observations are generally carried out by teacher coordinators, academic managers, quality managers too. Then in terms of self-observations, these observations are done by watching a recording of a lesson, of a particular lesson, and then completing a reflective task. The idea is to help with this activity artists to identify strengths and areas of opportunity and look and think back at the challenges as well as strategies and solutions employed, and to analyze specific aspects of performance. Similarly, this happens with peer observations. Teachers watch a recorded lesson of a strong or experienced colleague, and they complete a reflective task. Through this activity, artists should identify good practices in peers and take away ideas and strategies for their own implementation, with the belief that they will particularly profit from observing these diverse teaching styles. So in order to carry this out and to work in alignment with Ceibal and English, we decided to base parts of our learning and development scheme with the Ceibal Teaching Quality Framework that is composed of different domains and indicators, as you can see on the screen. There are 4 different domains, as you can read on the screen, that are engagement, responsiveness, deeper learning, and Ceibal specific requirements. And within them, there are different indicators that include information on, for example, input or the use of the VCE, the video conference equipment. Other indicators look for the way teachers plan and adapt their lessons, and how they create and adequate the materials for the learners, how they scaffold the lessons, if they make the lessons call on time, etc. So based on all these domains and indicators, our observation instruments and Ceibal observation instruments help us monitor the teaching quality and get to meet the Ceibal and English requirements for remote teaching. So what is important also to highlight is that, as Mariela mentioned, due to the pandemic situation, the length of the lessons was affected. So last year in 2021, from March till July, lessons lasted 25 minutes. They were telepresent sessions. And from July on, lessons went back to the 45-minute length format that learners knew. So now we will present you with these observation forms, and you will see that we will share one that is the contingency form used for the first half of the year, and then the form used for the months from July till December. So also what is important to highlight is that the self-observation and the peer observation forms are in just one form. So as you will see in the first video, this is the contingency in-house observation instrument for the 25-minute telepresent sessions. These instruments are based on the Ceibal quality indicators, as I said. And these indicators try to identify to what extent the required teaching standards in the program instructional framework are met by each remote teacher observed. Of course, there is a space, as you can see, for coordinators or managers observing to highlight the good practices and areas to improve. This is the latest observation, in-house observation instrument. Again, the aim is the same as in the previous one, but as you can see, it is longer, since it includes more stages of the lesson, which were covered in the 45-minute lessons. So now I will hand over to Mariela to talk about the next forms.
Thank you. So in the next video, we're going to see the self and peer observation instrument, which we used in the first term for remote teachers to reflect on 15-minute telepresence sessions that they observed. As you can see in the video, the questions in this instrument mirror the guidelines for telepresence released by the Ceibal en Inglés quality management team, and encourage remote teachers to become aware of and assess whether and how and to what extent either they in self-observation or their colleagues in peer observation met the different teaching standards in having to do with each domain and indicator in the observed lesson, and of course notice their own or their peers' strengths and areas of improvement. Now, similarly, in terms of peer observation, or the self and peer observation for the 45-minute lessons, we used a different CPD observation instrument as from the second term. And in this case, as you can see in the video, this instrument allowed remote teachers to narrow down the focus of their observation to only one quality indicator or one specific stage of the lesson. And this enabled remote teachers to reflect more deeply on their chosen area of interest or development, paying more closer and specific attention to the strategies employed in the lesson observed to meet each of the quality standards or indicators. Now let's go back to Florencia for the next part of the presentation.
Okay, so now it's time to share our findings. And as we mentioned before, we have more than 100 teachers in the remote teaching center in Buenos Aires, and observations for each of them were different. There were observations based on the synchronous work, that those are the telepresences, and the observations on the asynchronous work, that is the work on the CREA platform or the Little Bridge platform. So by December 2021, 1,384 in-house observations were done. More than half of the observations were done to existing staff, seconded by new teachers. And finally, 13.3% of these observations were carried out to teachers that later decided to leave the program. What is important here also to highlight is that as an organization that constantly looks for performance improvement and professional development, the number of observations to carry out are planned with anticipation, as you can see in the annual goals. In 2021, British Council scheduled around 5 observations per existing teacher, that is a teacher that has experience in the project because taught the previous year or comes from another institute that in which this teacher used to teach. So this teacher is observed throughout the year 5 times, and new teachers that are, well, new to the program were observed 6 times. So these observations were done by teacher coordinators, quality managers, and academic managers. So as you can see, the goals were exceeded by British Council, and our own internal goal exceeded what Ceibal, our client, expected from us. Teachers were observed more than the times we aimed at, which helped us identify very interesting things that we will share with you later. So, as you can see, this is a case study of a teacher who started teaching in the program by July. This teacher had the induction to the program and had different training sessions to get used to the way and the modality of this program. And the first observation was in August. As you can see, there were many areas that needed improvement, and then this teacher was observed in September again, and the areas for improvement were significantly reduced. But what happened between the August and September observation? Well, there were different actions carried out, such as self-observations, peer observations, work with the teacher coordinator. This teacher attended different webinars, worked with other colleagues. So there was a follow-up between the two observations. And the same with this other case I wanted to share with you. This teacher also had some areas that needed improvement. And after similar activities to the ones I mentioned, the areas that needed improvement were reduced significantly too. So now Mariela will share with you some testimonies of different teachers and numbers that are worth mentioning.
Thank you. So let me tell you a little bit about self-observations. And there were a total of 56 self-observations among remote teachers at the RTC, which is quite significant considering that all CPD activities were not mandatory for remote teachers, and they took part on own initiative. 39 of these self-observations were carried out using the contingency instrument for telepresence, and 17 of these were carried out using the second instrument that I showed you for 45-minute lessons. It is worth noting that in the latter, as we can see in the pie charts, the majority of RTs chose to focus on language learning environment and learners' L2 oral production as areas of interest, with special attention to the practice stage of the lesson. And in reading some of the remote teachers' final comments in these forms, we were pleased to find that many of the reflections evidenced the RT's awareness of their teaching performance and linked the observation with action plans, such as the ones that Florencia mentioned before, showing both understanding and willingness to effect changes in their classroom practices. So let's have a look at some of the comments that these remote teachers shared with us after taking part in self-observation. One of the RTs mentioned that they still needed to work on some aspects, but they did notice improvement in some areas and were eager to continuing getting better. Another RT mentioned that the new strategies that they had implemented in the observed lesson had a positive effect on the outcome of this specific lesson, especially in terms of learners' engagement. One other RT mentioned that reflecting on this daily practice was amazing and something that they would like to do more often. Yet another RT mentioned the fact that carrying out this self-observation was a great opportunity to see their own areas where they need improvement, and bringing this to light was key for them to challenge themselves and become more aware to try out different strategies and ultimately deliver better lessons, which is 100% our goal. And one last RT mentioned that they found this observation interesting and useful because they could see things in this self-observation that they did not realize in the moment while teaching. And this is one of the reasons why working with recorded lessons is fantastic, because it allows for a kind of outside perspective of our own performance. Now, moving to peer observations, there was a total of 24 peer observations which remote teachers carried out in the second term of the academic year, and they used the CPD observation form for 45-minute lessons. In this case, it was interesting to note that remote teachers chose in a majority to focus on participation and interaction patterns and input as areas of interest, which was different from what many chose for self-observation. And again, most of the RTs were interested in observing with a focus on the practice stage of the lesson, but also the production stage in quite a few cases, as you can see in the pie charts. Again, we have some comments that remote teachers left us in their observation forms. One of them mentioned that they appreciated the good practices observed in this lesson. And this is linked to what Florencia mentioned regarding choosing recordings of strong RTs or experienced RTs for other teachers to observe. From an organizational perspective, this was key for us to disseminate good practices and, in a way, cascade knowledge. Of course, there was some suggestions in this and some RTs commented on the fact that they would have found it interesting to also observe examples of more challenging groups or less ideal classroom scenarios. And it's something that we are, of course, planning to take on board for the observation scheme in the upcoming academic year. One other RT mentioned that it is very necessary to do peer observation and have a chance to discuss their report afterwards, either with their peers or with their teacher coordinators. And this is linked to what we were mentioning before, having to do with having action plans following these observations with a real towards engagement, the engagement stage in professional development. One other RT mentioned this idea of trying to implement something that they had seen in this peer observation that their colleague did and that they would like to adopt in their own lessons. In this case, it was the tone of voice and pace. And it's just an example of how perhaps watching a peer in action can spark some ideas and give remote teachers new tips or strategies for own implementation in their classrooms. Now, one final interesting fact that we would like to mention having to do with our observation scheme is that 15 of the remote teachers who identified areas of opportunity through this observation process went on to complete exploratory action research cycles, which they found very profitable in terms of planning, experimenting, and reflecting on new teaching practices or new strategies to implement with their students in the lessons. So I will now hand back over to Florencia to share some conclusions with us.
Okay, thank you, Mariela. And as she mentioned, we will share with you some of our conclusions throughout this experience. So what we want to say is that a clear and step-by-step CPD framework is key for teaching practice improvement and innovation. Observations are a great activity to identify strengths and areas for opportunity, to look and think back at challenges as well as strategies and solutions employed, and to analyze specific aspects of performance. Observations and feedback help develop collaborative learning. This feedback we give must be objective, systematic, supportive, and motivating. It's also key to design a well-thought observation instrument catering for the different teacher needs and objectives, which support them to grow individually and collaboratively. And for an observation scheme to be successful, organizations should create a culture of observations, which is by no means judgmental, but developmental. So the idea of these observations that we carry out, that peers carry out, is to just give feedback, just to help and learn from one another, but not to judge. So observations also should be followed up by action plans, such as conversations, specific activities which support performance improvement and or skills acquisition. For this last bit, it's important to carry these activities out with a follow-up activity, as we shared in the case study before, so as to see the progress with the time. And we are happy to say that observations, after having a proper follow-up with conversations, with action points, with literature, with courses to attend, helped teachers develop. And that was then visible in the observations of the same groups, but later. So we have reached the end of this presentation. These are our list of references. And well, we want to thank you very much for having attended this session with us.